War was to become the fate of a generation of Jews living in Palestine, the land of Israel. They, and often their parents, were people who had struggled and built for half a century, inspired by a dream of Jewish sovereignty. And they were to be joined by Jews from Arab countries, and by those who had survived the European tragedy and longed for a homeland free from persecution.
Egypt? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
Resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstained.
At the end of the Second World War, the Jews of Palestine were determined to establish a state, the first manifestation of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel for 2,000 years. On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations voted to establish two states, one Jewish, one Arab, in a partitioned Palestine. The Arabs swore to resist the creation of a Jewish state even by war. This film is the story of that war. This is the land of Israel, also called Palestine since the Roman conquest 2,000 years earlier. It was some 300 miles long and 40 miles wide, a land that had been fought over for centuries. It would now be fought over once again. The partition plan gave the Jews of Palestine a small state within the land of Israel. Areas of predominantly Arab population were to become part of the Arab state, including most of the Galilee. Predominantly Jewish areas would remain Jewish. The Negev was given to the Jews. Jerusalem at the map's center was to be internationalized. The British had conquered Palestine during the First World War, and the League of Nations had authorized a British mandate to govern the country. Palestine seemed somehow not a mandated territory, but part and parcel of the British Empire, an empire that found itself under siege after the Second World War, as more and more people strove to become independent. The British had ruled Palestine for 30 years. More than 30 British forts were scattered throughout the country. They controlled strategic roads and junctions. The forts were built in 1936 against the Arab revolt. In 1948, as the British prepared to withdraw, each one became the scene of a bitter struggle for control between Jews and Arabs. This fort at Gesher was located near the railway crossing of the River Jordan that connected Palestine to Transjordan and Syria. At the center of the country at Latrun, this was the police fort, which dominated the entrance to the gorge leading up to Jerusalem from the coastal plain. The Jewish population of Palestine was only 600,000 when the War of Independence began. Yet from that small community, there emerged a group of leaders of rare quality. They were a generation that had hoped to be farmers and builders of the land, but were made leaders by a tumultuous series of events. David Ben-Gurion was the leader of the Jewish community and became the first Prime Minister of Israel. Yigal Allon was a military commander of excellence and daring, a native-born Israeli. His associate, Yitzhak Rabin, was also native-born. Yigal Yadin was a brilliant strategist who became Army Chief of Staff and later a world-renowned archaeologist. Moshe Dayan also made his mark in Israel's War of Independence. He was both a warrior and later a statesman. Menachem Begin was the leader of the Irgun, committed not to partition but to Jewish sovereignty in the entire land. The Jews of Israel were divided into a number of armies or military groupings. All of them had been underground armies during the Mandate, conducting training far from the eyes of the British police. The Haganah was the strongest of the pre-state armies. It reported to the head of the Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion. As the war started, the Haganah had 32,000 part-time soldiers registered and about 13,000 weapons, mostly rifles. The Haganah had scarcely enough ammunition for 3 days fighting. The Palmach was the elite commando unit, drawing much of its membership from collective settlements, the kibbutzim. It was also part of the Haganah, but had a semi-independent command. On the eve of war, the Palmach had 3,000 fighters in its ranks. The Etzel or Irgun was a right-wing force. Its members engaged in terrifying acts of violence against the British and the Arabs. The Irgun had some 2,000 fighters within its ranks. Directly after the United Nations decision to partition Palestine, the euphoric dream of Jewish statehood in the land of Israel was punctured by the harsh reality of gunfire. 3 days after Arab snipers attacked a civilian bus on the Mediterranean coast, killing 5 Jews, Arabs stormed the Jewish commercial center in Jerusalem, outside the Jaffa Gate, causing havoc and destruction, and nearly burning it to the ground. No one was killed, but the Jewish population was in shock. In Jerusalem and elsewhere, Arab and Jewish communities were already in a state bordering on war. British patrols sought to secure peace and order within the country. Meanwhile, the British formulated secret plans for their departure from the country. The leader of Palestine's Jews was David Ben-Gurion. He was respected and even feared by his colleagues. Ben-Gurion wanted to fight the Arabs, curb the power of the dissident Irgun, and forge a Jewish nation. His vision of a democratic Jewish state and his strategy for attaining it shaped the fight of the new Israelis against their enemies. Some of Ben-Gurion's decisions, judged by conventional military standards, were unusual. He was determined to hold Jerusalem, the historic religious symbol of Jewish statehood and nationhood, and to hold it against all military advice. The city was far from the coastal plain, subject to Arab siege, and extraordinarily difficult to defend. Ben-Gurion was also committed, against military advice, to the defense of every single Jewish settlement. Just to the south of Jerusalem was Gush Etzion, a group of 4 small collective settlements, or kibbutzim, with only a few hundred residents. Gush Etzion was located outside the borders of the Jewish state in the United Nations partition plan. In early January, a Palmach officer, Uzi Narkis, became the Gush Etzion commander.
Immediately, when I look at that block, I understood the block was doomed. There was no opportunity, no chance for those 4 little kibbutzim, tiny kibbutzim, already besieged, to survive.
Convoys to Gush Etzion from Jerusalem had to pass through a number of Arab villages and Arab-controlled roads. Within a few days of Narkis's having arrived, Arabs from surrounding villages attacked the settlement.
On January the 14th, in the morning, I think that never in my life I saw so many Arabs in that valley here, which is called the Valley of the Blessing. And all of them, so many, thousands, were moving slowly, mainly towards Kfar Etzion.
Narkis got a message by radio from a nearby kibbutz that the Arabs had stopped to eat breakfast before their assault. That pause provided the opportunity. Narkis authorized an attack.
So the Palmach platoon caught them in the middle of eating, stormed them, attacked them, and all of them withdrew, killed or injured or whatever. And that was really the break of the attack.
The Jewish troops were left with little weaponry and almost no ammunition. Narkis requested help from the Palmach Command Center at Kibbutz Ma'aleh HaHamishah. A special mission was authorized. On January the 15th, 35 men, including many students from the Hebrew University, set off on foot through the Judean hills at night to bring reinforcements to the defenders of the Etzion block. They had no radio. An Arab whom they met apparently misdirected them and then mobilized the Arab villagers against them. All 35 were killed. Arabs from the surrounding villages gathered to view the dead. These photographs were captured later by Israeli forces. The bodies were mutilated.
That was really very, very tough, because the Arabs, Palestinians at that time, listen, you kill your enemy, okay. Why do you have to dismember him?
The killing of the 35 brought home the reality of a brutal war to Palestinian Jews. The funeral was somber. Pictures of the mutilated bodies were not released to the public. The civilian leader of Kibbutz Kfar Etzion was David Ben David.
That was a shock, and we were afraid that the fate of the 35 could be our fate as well. There were many opinions. Some were more strong, some were not so strong as I was, but that gave us the feeling that a very hard fate is going to happen to us.
This is the youth village of Ben Shemen, located near the Arab city of Lod and outside the Jewish state according to the United Nations partition plan. This film, shown here for the first time, was taken by one of the teachers of Ben Shemen and sat in a desk drawer for 50 years. The youngsters were mainly survivors of the Holocaust. British soldiers, together with Haganah Guards, accompanied the youngsters. They travelled to Kfar Vitkin, a village in Jewish-held territory on the Mediterranean coast, where they hoped they would find safety. To the north of the country, the battle was also developing. The northern cities were mixed, including both Jews and Arabs. Haifa, on the seashore, was the country's main port and still under British control. The British were using their power to stifle Jewish immigration. Though most of the Galilee was populated with Arab villages, Israeli kibbutzim were scattered throughout the area. An Arab Liberation Army under Qaukji operated with the support of the vaunted Syrian army. It controlled the plains of the north. On the 16th of February, Qaukji's forces attacked in the Jordan Valley at Tirat Tzvi, a religious kibbutz. The Jews staved off the attack. 1 Jew and 40 Arabs were killed. To save face, the Arabs claimed a great victory with 300 Jewish dead. In Jerusalem, the battle was also developing. On the 22nd of February, there was a major explosion on Ben Yehuda Street. 47 Jews were killed. 130 were wounded. The Jews were furious. They suspected the involvement of deserters from the British Army, helping the Arabs plant the bombs. On the 11th of March, there was yet another explosion. This one at the Jewish Agency building in the center of Jerusalem, effectively the seat of Jewish government. A car filled with explosives was left at the entrance by a previously trusted Arab employee of the United States Consulate. The explosion killed 12 Jews. The Arab villages surrounding Jerusalem created a stranglehold on the city, cutting it off from the coast. The Arabs would harass and attack convoys, causing casualties and death. The Palmach's crack Harel Brigade was given the job of holding the road to Jerusalem. Among those with the brigade was a 17-year-old nurse, Tzipi Neria.
On that hill, that one with the beautiful fir tree, the Arabs waited there, and they'd informed the Arab villages around here that we were coming. There was the village Beit Mahsur, Saris, and other Arab villages. They'd wait over there, inform all the other villages, and then they'd be waiting for us on the road. They'd come down to the road itself, firing at our tires. Simply, it became face-to-face battle. They got that close to our convoys.
Each convoy was a desperate venture. A number were stopped. There was looting and killing. Many Jewish lives were lost. Some convoys got through. As the battles continued, the myths and legends grew. One young poet wrote at the time, "The convoys broke through to the city. On both sides of the road our dead are piled up. The iron skeleton is as quiet as my friend, Bab el-Wad. Remember our names forever, Bab el-Wad, on the road to the city." The iron skeletons still stand on the road to Jerusalem, reminders of the battle. Directly following the Second World War, European Jews had tried desperately to gain entrance to Palestine, but were blocked by British restrictions. Many of these Jews were Holocaust survivors. They dreamed not just of refuge in the land of Israel, but of a secure life in a Jewish state. British surveillance of the Palestine coast was constant, though the British managed to keep many Jews out. They principally succeeded in making the Jewish refugees only more determined to reach the land they regarded as home. The Haganah ship Unafraid was one of those stopped. When caught, the refugees were shipped to detention camps on the island of Cyprus, some 200 miles away. Some European Jews, however, had already sneaked through the barrier of British surveillance. Among them was one of the few who knew how to shoot a machine gun, a Holocaust survivor who had been a partisan fighter in the forests of Poland, and then afterwards had trained others at the Bergen-Belsen displaced persons camp. His name, Menachem Ullman.
I took a choice to come here, to create a country, to marry, to bring up children for everyone who was killed in the Holocaust in Europe. This fighting here was like to be in Warsaw in the ghetto. No chance to go out, but we have to fight.
April 1948. It became known as the Cruel Month. It was both cruel and crucial, a month that would determine the direction of the war. Inside Jerusalem, there was fighting to control individual neighborhoods. There were Jewish victories, but also losses. The Arab siege on Jerusalem tightened. Jewish Jerusalemites had barely enough to eat or drink. Each drop of water was precious. It was estimated that only 2 weeks' food supply stood between Jerusalem and starvation. Shelling came from the old city and Arab villages around Jerusalem. Jewish areas were held, but there was no territorial contiguity, making effective defense difficult. The Jewish quarter of the old city, populated mostly by religious Jews, was reinforced by Haganah and Palmach fighters. On the outskirts of Jerusalem, Arab villagers and irregular troops surrounded the city, assaulting the convoys bringing food and supplies. The Jews suffered terrible losses. Menachem Ullman, was an eyewitness.
Memories of death and life, of sacrificing, patriotism, of united people, that they have been ready to do